Get started as people are still logging in. We would like to welcome you to our fourth final webinar of the series, Equity Grounded Counseling. Today's topic, we'll be discussing serving Black students and maintaining equity focus in the face of oppressive structures. We have two dynamic speakers and leaders in the community college who will be giving some great insight who I'll be introducing very shortly. But before we jump into that, again, we just want to cover a few things. And first of all, say welcome to you all. And we're so glad that you are spending this Friday to join us and to engage in a conversation that we believe is critical to the success of the students that we are serving. So just a few things that we're going to cover. This is an open space, so we encourage you to engage. You'll notice at the bottom that there's a Q&A, so if you have any questions, we ask that you put your questions in the Q&A. If you have some thoughts as the presenters are presenting, we ask that you put those in the chat because we believe this is a community space, and this unity helps build strength. This is one of the reasons why we have our consan symbol. It is a Dinker symbol. So we really want you to be able to engage, connect, because you are important to this work that we are doing. So without further ado, I would like to introduce someone who is very helpful and kind of behind the scenes has been helping us. Luis Chavez, who is our senior director of the Career Ladders Project, founding member of Colegas. So Luis, go ahead and take it away.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining, and we're hoping you're keeping safe and doing well. And thank you to you, Dr. Acronis, and especially Dr. Stewart, for this amazing series that we've had all along here. On behalf of the Career Ladders Project and the California Counseling Network, we are proud to have been involved with you in helping produce these webinars as part of the series coinciding with Black History Month. I'm especially happy about these series because it's right in line with what we've been supporting through the California Counseling Network, and that is practitioner-to-practitioner learning and exchange. There's no better exchange possibility if you don't have the opportunity to be in front of your colleagues. This is the way to do it, where we're able to bring folks together through amazing technology. As we continue through this time of unprecedented change, challenge, and disruption, we're hoping that you will continue to work with us as we go through these webinars to push ourselves to become equity action-oriented practitioners and scholars, to lift up the profession, the service that we give to our students by elevating our understanding of the deeper issues of equity and what it calls us to. Through the community of sharing and learning, we can achieve effectively building a new network of support that's deeper, broader, that will help support Black students across the state and beyond. They so much deserve it and they need it. And in this series, we've learned about empathy, on how it can be a tool. We've looked and examined and deconstructed the counseling process. We've examined basic needs. And today, the focus continues on maintaining that focus on equity that has been a through line of this series. In some ways, these webinars have been taking us and talking with us as we're learning how to climb this new hill that we're on. We've been hearing and learning from amazing practitioners and scholars about the practices and concepts and ideas, and some remarkable students. I encourage everyone to go back and listen and watch the webinars. For this last session, I believe the presenters are going to connect the dots between those concepts and practices. It is my pleasure and honor to present and introduce our brilliant presenters today. Dr. Wendy Stewart, Dean of Counseling and Student Development at Mira Costa College, adjunct faculty at UCSD Education Program and National University, and Nicole Jones, who is the Dean of Counseling at Cuyamaca College, lecturer, San Diego State University, coach, consultant with North Compass Consulting. Thank you, Dr. Stewart, for the trust and partnership. It has been a wonderful learning journey with you and your team. It is our pleasure to support these webinar series with you and look forward to doing it again in the future. Finally, to our audience, please engage with us. Jot down what you hear and learn and follow up. Now, let's go climb this hill together. Thank you.
Thank you, Luis, and good morning. And thank you to everyone for joining us. Before we proceed, we want to just pay homage to our ancestors and ask for permission from an elder in the room to move forward. So I'm going to lean on my colleague, Don Love, who's in the space, if he can give us permission.
You got permission.
Thank you, Don. So it's time to get into some good trouble. We put together this 4-part webinar series in a very specific order for a very specific reason. So the first 3 webinars focused on providing skills, tools, and different ways that we can look at equity-grounded counseling and serving our Black students at our campuses. But we know that we are working in a system that impacts our ability to enact change. So this webinar, and it was intentionally designed to be the last webinar in the series, because we want to look at what is systemic racism and how does it impact the work that we do? How do we see it around us in our campuses? We're going to talk about specifically Black students in higher education and get into some data pieces. We're going to look at a framework to identify and disrupt systemic racism and as we engage in our equity-grounded counseling work. And then we're going to have a call to action around intentional leadership and improved outcomes. So I'm going to start with a quote. And I'm going to read this out loud, and I want you to think about how this may or may not apply to the work that you are doing in the space that you specifically are in. If the ladder of educational opportunity rises high at the doors of some youth and scarcely rises at the doors of others, while at the same time formal education is made a prerequisite to occupational and social advance, then education may become the means not of eliminating race and class distinctions, but of deepening and solidifying them. So what I find so fascinating about this quote is that I think it is so relevant to the equity concerns, the gaps that we see for our Black students across higher education. But maybe what stands out to me the most about this quote is that it was made over 73 years ago. So Harry Truman said this quote when there was a report that was commissioned to look at higher education and the achievement gaps that were present that involved race, class, and culture. So when we're talking about systems, we're not talking about an isolated incident. We're not talking about the experience that happens in a classroom. We're not talking about the experience that might happen in our offices. We're talking about a system that surrounds us and that is really woven into the very fabric of the institutions that we work at. So I want to pose a question for you to think about as we move forward. When was your college founded, and what was the status of Black Americans at that time on your campus? Were there any Black Americans? So Brown versus Board of Education happened in 1954. The college where I work at was founded in the early 1930s. If a Black student walked on campus, would they even be allowed to take classes there? So when we talk about systems, we're not talking about something that happens in the moment. We are talking about something that has existed in this country for 400 years. We could argue has been woven into at the foundation of what our country is and what our institutions are. So we're going to start with what is structural, systemic, institutional racism, and you'll find different definitions for each of these. For the purposes of the webinar, we're going to talk about them as really one entity and focus in on systemic racism, institutional racism. So one definition is a form of racism that is embedded as normal practice within society or an organization that can lead to issues such as discrimination in criminal justice, employment, housing, healthcare, political power, education. And we can also look at it as the normalization and legitimization of historical, cultural, institutional, and interpersonal dynamics that routinely advantage whites while producing adverse outcomes for people of color. So on the next slide, you'll see just a few pieces of data, and you'll see that it covers the screen, right? So again, we're talking systemic. When we look at how do we see systemic racism play out, if you are Black, you receive less overall healthcare rates of coverage, access, and quality of care. You're underrepresented in high-paying jobs, corporate hierarchies, and in the government. You're more likely to live in poverty, more likely to work in a dangerous job and have unhealthy housing stocks. You have higher exposure and more lethal consequences for reacting to violence, stress, and racism. More likely to be discriminated against in the workplace. You have higher death rates from a multitude of health threats, have a lower life expectancy. You're 3 times more likely than whites to get COVID-19 and more likely to work in a job that does not accommodate remote work. And the data goes on. So we have to put ourselves in the mindset of a system that goes beyond just how can I make change in this one corner where I'm working, but how do I really look and recognize what that system looks like in my institution? And so perhaps there is no better example of that than what happened in January. So what you see before you is a picture on the right of the arming of the Capitol building over 2 weeks in advance of what was a peaceful Black Lives Matter protest in Washington, D.C. And that is in contrast to, on the left, a picture we are all too familiar with, when there was an insurrection and rioters took over the Capitol, right? Predominantly white rioters. So there was a lot of folks who were saying this is not America. And I would argue this is exactly who America is. And we have to recognize that and lean into that if we're really going to do this work. So I'm going to pass it off to my colleague, Nicole, who's going to ground us in what does systemic racism look like when we're talking about higher education.
Thank you, Dr. Stewart, and thank you to everyone who tuned in today. I'm going to dig a little bit deeper into some data for you. And we're going to start with this depiction here of equality. What does equality really mean? And thinking about separate but equal, we know that that didn't work well for us. So this idea of equality is, give everyone an equal opportunity and they will be successful. This notion that if you give everyone an opportunity to start at the same place, they will eventually be able to, as this picture shows, climb the ladder and reach their ultimate goal. However, in the next slide, what we see is that equality isn't necessarily the foundation to create an equal opportunity for everyone. What ends up happening is that some folks have more of an advantage based on various factors, such as race, such as socioeconomic status, such as access to various resources. So you see that certain elements can provide individuals with more of an opportunity than others when we think we're actually giving everyone the same starting point. Students who don't have the same amount of advantage as others often find that there are more than enough challenges in front of them. Those challenges include the bias and the systemic racism that they have to face. The pathway is often broken. The pathway is often misrepresented with a lot of challenges, pitfalls, stumbling blocks that are placed before them. Things such as microaggressions and implicit bias, being a first generation college student. So there's so many pitfalls that are actually there in their way. I know that for me, one of the analogies I like to use to kind of explain this is just thinking about running track. I used to run track. And when you run a relay, your starts are staggered. And your starts are staggered because if you don't stagger the starts, then the people who are actually on the inside of the track have a higher advantage to get to the finish line a lot faster. So you have to be able to provide a staggered start for these students and eliminate those microaggressions and those barriers along the way. We have to acknowledge that there is systemic racism, there is bias in our system, and these institutions weren't necessarily built for the students that we're serving in order for them to get through the pipeline. As we continue on and think about our data from a more broad perspective, we'll look into our next slide and see that from a higher education standpoint, there is a lot of disparity, in particular for African American students. So here you see that the 6-year outcomes by race and ethnicity, a very large N. You can see the disaggregation based on race and ethnicity at the bottom. And you can see that the African American students are down with their completion rates. Their completion rates, unfortunately, do not put them at the same rate as the other individuals in the depiction. Let's go to the next slide. Now we're narrowing it down to what's happening in the state of California. The state of California has done extensive research with thought leaders from all over our institutions to really take a look at what is this problem with getting our Black students through the pipeline to completion in our colleges. So the Campaign for College Opportunity has been doing these reports, and as you can see, 89% of our Black 19-year-olds will graduate high school, but only 35% are eligible to enter into UC or CSUs. These are the statistics that we really need to digest, and these statistics should promote a level of outrage within all of us. These statistics aren't necessarily new. These are statistics that were published on an annual basis. There is another report that has recently been released. We're not seeing the gains for Black students that we would like to see, that we need to see. 2/3 of Black adults attend college, but only 1/3 will earn a degree. These are significant data points that we really need to digest, and we really need to look at what are we doing in our institutions that keeps creating the type of data that we see, the type of outcomes that we see for our Black African American students. Moving on and getting a little bit more granular, we have to notice that language and words and how we shape our reality makes a huge difference. Oftentimes, we will talk about the small percentage of Black students that are in our community college system. We will often hear, well, you know, there's only 5.9% of our total population that are Black. However, that is a lot of students. That's approximately 123,000 students. In addition to that, the language that we use when we minimize the amount of students almost makes it seem as if it's not significant or important. So we have to be careful when we're in spaces on our campus and we're saying, well, we only have 100 students in our Umoja program, or we only have this many students participating in this particular activity who are Black. These students are our students, and it is very significant for us to make sure that we use inclusive language when we're describing them. On this slide, you will see that the community college transfer rates for students who are Black is only 35%, which is being compared to white students, which is nearly half of them who will complete within 6 years. As we move forward, in this slide, we can look at the graduation rates that are lower for Black students than white students. And particularly if we look at where we see the highest gains and achievement in the UCs or the privates in this graph, there are fewer of our students who are Black that are attending. The majority of our students are attending our California community colleges, and that is where we see a huge disparity for students to be able to complete within the time period that we need them to get their degree. As we look at what's happening right now in our society and we think about COVID-19, we have to acknowledge that COVID-19 has exacerbated every disadvantage that was already there for our students. There were already gaps for access to affordable housing. There were already gaps to access to quality medical care. There was already gaps for economic prosperity and creating generational wealth within the Black community. There were already gaps for our students to attain higher and achieve within education, their goals. So as we think about where we are currently with COVID-19 layered on top of all the inequities that already exist in our society, what are we thinking about doing to help erase these achievement gaps for our students that already existed? We know that within our Black community, many members of our Black community have become unemployed as a result of COVID-19. They may not regain the same employment once this pandemic has ended. They may need retraining. They may need additional skills. We also know that we have lost a lot of students that we may never see come back and return to our systems. This is a critical moment in our time, but there's also a critical opportunity for us to do something about it, to build something new for our students that is going to help them be successful. So thinking about where we are, there has been a tremendous impact on the equity gap that exists for our Black students. There was already an equity gap, and now we have to think really long and hard about how we can eliminate that equity gap that is related to COVID-19, which is going to help create better opportunities for our students moving forward. So now I'm going to turn it back over to my colleague, Dr. Stewart.
Thank you. So I think an analogy that is appropriate when we start to think about systems of racism, right? So we know the data, we know a little bit about what's happening with our Black students, and we know that our students are not being served in higher education systems, including the systems where we work. That doesn't mean there's not good work happening, but there's a larger system and a fabric that we need to be aware of. And so there's a quote by a hip hop advocate, artist, educator that I think is appropriate, that white supremacy isn't the shark, it's the water. And that really speaks to why it is so difficult sometimes for us to identify and even think about how do we dismantle that system when it's woven into the institutions where we work, right? It's the water that's around us. It would be so much easier if it was something concrete. And I use the analogy of if racism was a wall that was in the middle of campus, we would know exactly the tools, the equipment that was needed to tear the wall down, right? But it's not something that is so concrete, that is so easy for us to address. It's something that sometimes is unconscious. And so there's another quote by David Foster Wallace, who in 2005 used an analogy to describe how are we impacted by things unconsciously. And so it's another water analogy. There are these two young fish swimming along, and they happen to meet an older fish swimming the other way, who nods and says to them, "Morning, boys, how's the water?" And the two young fish swim on for a bit, and eventually one of them looks at the other and goes, "What the hell is water?" So part of dismantling systemic racism and why it is so difficult in this work is because there are times when we unconsciously aren't even aware of what is happening. And I can speak as a Black mother that I have never been more aware of what that looks like than after I had my child. So I have a second grader, and I thought, okay, I'm going to work to make sure there's representation so that he sees himself positively, especially because I know he's going to grow up as a Black man in a society, right, where there's hostile environments. But that is like a full-time job to ensure that there are depictions of Black boys in his books, to ensure that he understands that you are not alone as he looks at the Zoom screen and sees he's the only brown face that's on the screen. And I've realized that the totality of the issue, because it's not just about the struggle to have representation, it's the realization that I came that in some cases, There's not representation out there for me to find. I have to create that space for him. So on the next slide, we're going to dive into what is a tool for how do we create those spaces? How do you look and see the water and dismantle the water? And so we're going to talk about frames. So Dr. Estela Ben-Simon, who is a former professor of mine and is well known in higher education for her work around equity, she came up with a way to think about closing the achievement gap in higher education from looking at what frame are we looking through. And so there's 3 frames that are presented here. The first one is the deficit frame. Well-meaning but pessimistic attributes, such as concluding that students cannot be expected to overcome the disadvantages of poverty and under-preparation, right? The deficit frame implies that the academic difficulties of minority students are either self-inflicted or a natural outcome of socioeconomic and educational background. The deficit frame looks at unequal outcomes as to be something expected and that it's a problem without a solution. A diversity frame, which a lot of work sometimes lands in diversity, right? We call it equity, but in a lot of cases it's falling in the diversity frame. The diversity frame focuses attention on demographic characteristics of the student body, views diversity in terms of interracial contact and human relations. Looks at diversity as an institutional characteristic that promotes learning outcomes and better prepares students for an increasingly diverse workforce in society. So it's that concept that I respect all races. I don't see race in my students, right? And then the equity frame is color conscious in an affirmative sense. In the equity frame, we're more prone to notice and question patterns of educational outcomes. So we sit in that space and we don't just observe the patterns, but we ask ourselves, why is that pattern existing? You're more likely to view inequalities in the context of a history of exclusion, discrimination, and educational apartheid. That's a heavy one, educational apartheid. And you're far more likely to understand that the beliefs, expectations, and actions of individuals influence whether minority group students are construed as being capable or incapable. So what does this look like in our counseling offices, in our counseling practice? We're going to look at how we see sometimes what the deficit frame looks like in culture and environment and outcomes. And then you're actually going to have an opportunity to engage and think specifically about your campus. We're going to engage in an interactive Mentee Meter where you're going to have a chance to respond to a prompt. So if we look at culture, right, and how this deficit frame might exist in our institutional culture, in our counseling office culture, we see in the institution, students are viewed as either college prepared or unprepared. Black student resources are viewed in proportion to their percentage of the population. Language minimizes the mention of race in equity work. In our counseling offices, we sometimes see this in that the most prepared students have the greatest access to counselors and information. Black students are referenced as being a small percentage of the population in discussions about counseling strategies. Counseling services for Black students are relegated to counselors and programs geared specifically to Black students. And students are expected to already know the importance of seeing a counselor and developing a plan. And so I have a quote there that comes from our Black Student Union at Miracosta College. We had a hate crime that happened on campus and students created t-shirts that said, I am more than 3%, right? And so those were students who were feeling what the deficit frame culture is when students are categorized as being a small percentage of the population. On the next slide, we can see what the deficit frame might look like if we're looking at environment. So in the institution, we see a system that can be accessed and provide support to those who are most familiar with the system. In our counseling offices, we see students are expected to meet a series of screening requirements prior to booking an appointment. Appointments, drop-ins, and workshops are based on the most convenient schedules for the department. Equity trainings are optional, not mandated, and equity is addressed only in the context of those programs that are geared towards equity. Counselors and staff may or may not reflect the identities of the students served. And we know that there's a lot of external and internal dynamics that may lead to this, but how many of you are sitting there and looking at this and nodding your head right now? And so I think about a student who came into my office when we were on ground prior to COVID, who came in to book an appointment and just had a meltdown in the front office, was very frustrated. And I brought her into my office and she said, I took my lunch break from work to get here. This is the only day I have to do this. And this was a single parent. She left work on her lunch break thinking, I have a question, I need a plan. I'm going to take this time to come into the counseling office. And there was all these barriers that were set up that she realized I can't even make an appointment, right? So on the next slide, we think about what are the outcomes, right? So what does this ultimately lead to? In our institutions, we see it, and Nicole talked about this. There are inequitable outcomes that are repeated over time. We see that college students who are deemed as prepared, those are the students who persist. Students who are looked at as unprepared do not, right? They fall through the cracks. In our counseling offices, we see this in that educational plans, counseling services, all of the rich services that are designed to help students to succeed are disproportionately used by dominant culture students. Black students face discrimination, prejudgment, conscious and unconscious bias that can ultimately impact the direction that they go in. So we see our Black students who are majoring in the same majors, right? Not looking at STEM, not looking at areas where they don't see themselves represented. And you have advising and counseling that's taking place that are tracking students. Black students face barriers in accessing services that are not designed with them in mind. So we're going to take a minute, and I see you in the chat, so keep the conversation going. But I want you to, we're going to actually give you a chance to respond to a prompt. So the prompt is, where do you see evidence of deficit frame in your counseling departments? And this is anonymous. So we want you to click on the link that's going to pop in on the chat. And that's going to take you to what we call Mentee Meter. And we're going to see live some of the comments that folks are going to respond with. So we'll give you a quick minute here. Click on the link. I know some of you might be accessing this on your phone. And go ahead and respond. Think about in a word, in a sentence, if you were to look at your counseling office, staffing, colleagues, right? The environment that exists around counseling, where would you see evidence of that deficit frame being present? And for those who aren't able to use Mentee Meter, feel free to pop in a comment in the chat. So we expect students to come to us rather than going to them, right? Counselors have limited scheduling, right? Somebody else made a comment, scheduling. Our front desk has an attitude, right? And we know that sometimes that is the first contact that students have coming into the office is at that front desk, right? Having to wait for appointments. We know that sometimes that wait can get as long as 45 minutes, an hour. Staffing challenges. Not having services that are available during the weekends or evening times. Counselors not given flexibility to spend real quality time with students. Not being available on the weekends. Black students are funneled to one of the 2 Black counselors that are in the department. Having to wait for appointments. So all of these we know are barriers that face our students, right? Our Black students when they are coming to our offices. And we know that oftentimes counseling might be that first stop. So depending on what that student experiences, that student might disappear after leaving the office when they hit up against some of those barriers and realize this isn't for me, right? So go ahead and keep the comments coming in, but we're going to shift back into the presentation. So what we want to do is make a shift to an equity frame, right? We want to be able to identify the water. We want to be able to look around us and be able to see the deficit frame that exists sometimes in our offices. And it's self-reflection time too, right? The deficit frame can sometimes happen with us. You have time constraints. You have other types of limitations that sometimes push you to go quickly. I'm going to look at the transcript and make a decision about what the student is or isn't capable of doing based solely on their GPA, based solely on the courses that I see there. Or that student comes in front of me, and that's the 4th Black student that I've seen, and that is interested in sociology, and I'm going to take that at face value and not mention any other options, right? Not taking into account maybe the historical elements of why that student might be interested in that particular major. And we're going to go ahead and move forward with educational planning, because I've got a line of drop-ins, right? I have a line of students that are waiting. I don't have the time to be able to sit and take with that student. So shifting to an equity frame means that in some cases, we need to put on a completely different set of glasses and look at our environment, look at our practice, look at our institutions with new eyes. So if we were to look at the culture of an institution, what would that look like if it was an equity framed culture? The institution takes responsibility for meeting students where they are and ensuring success. And Nicole said this, our students come to us however they are, with whatever preparation they are. It is our responsibility as the institution to educate that student and to meet the student's needs wherever they are. There is evidence that Black student narratives and experiences are valued. Language is framed in terms of how the institution can meet the needs of Black students and optimize success. So what does that look like in our counseling offices? What would an equity framed culture look like? Efforts are intentional to connect Black students early and underscore the relevance of counseling. So somebody had put in the Mentee Meter that Black students are expected to come to us, find the office on campus, right? And just come in knowing that counseling is a critical part. But an equity framed approach is, where are our students and how do we go to them? How do we find our students and have that dialogue? Students are seen through the lens of the Black experience with recognition of the water. In equity work, I sometimes have to remind colleagues that racism isn't the problem. Me being Black isn't the problem. I love being Black. I don't love what being Black oftentimes means in the society that I live in, but don't look at me and say that I don't see you for your color. I'm a Black woman. I want you to see me through the lens of my color, right? And so we have to, it's what you do with that lens that is the critical piece. Are you looking at it in an affirmative sense and understanding what the cultural lens of, there's a Black student in front of me and what does that mean for that student? So equity framed culture in counseling offices means that efforts to serve Black students are universal across all departments. So this is another quote from a student. I know that I can come by anytime because I know I am wanted and welcome. And this is a quote that I heard from a student from our counseling operations supervisor at Maricosta, who is a white man who intentionally connects with students. So he walks in the understanding that who he is might immediately present a barrier, that students might look at him and go, I don't know, right? Is he somebody who is an ally, or is he somebody who is going to replicate other experiences that I've had? And so he makes efforts to make sure that there's space for Emoja in the office, to greet students and say, hey, I see you. How was your day, right? I don't know if you're coming in to make a counseling appointment, but either way, I'm going to connect with you. And so what we hear back from our students is, I'm wanted, right? I feel that. I feel a sense of belonging. When we move forward and look at environment, what we see in equity framed environment for an institution, it looks like the institution designs strategies that addresses historical racism and oppression, right? Again, thinking about who the institution is built for and who the institution was not built for. There is authentic and intentional connections made with the Black community. And that sometimes means we have to go beyond the walls of our institution. So right now, and COVID is a classic example, we're doing things virtually. And one of the benefits of that is I'm seeing that we're able to connect with our community in ways that maybe we weren't before, because it's as simple as sending a Zoom link and inviting somebody into the space. There's disaggregated data around Black student success that is both accessible and regularly discussed. And there are professional learning opportunities around anti-Black racism, white privilege, implicit bias, microaggressions, topics that are relevant to understanding the impact of systemic racism. So what does that environment look like in our counseling offices? Counseling services are flexible and designed to meet the needs of Black students as they come into the office. If a Black student walks into the office or a student meets with you virtually, what about the space that we occupy sends the message you are welcome? And we have to look at this in the context that our Black students are existing on our campuses and spaces that are regularly sending messages, you are not welcome. So how are we intentionally looking to flip that script? Services are offered in a variety of different modalities and times. So many of you on the Mentee Meter listed that services are offered only during the day, right? They're offered during a time that meets with the convenience of those who are offering the services. But a lot of our Black students are working. A lot of our Black students have other responsibilities outside of school. So what types of opportunities are we offering for evenings? We just started to do Saturday sessions and ramp those up this past year at Maricosta. And it's been amazing when we're talking about equity, students who are saying, this is great, right? And even virtually, even though I know that that might not be the ideal medium, there are students who can say that my son is sitting next to me and I can sit and do a counseling appointment. I don't have to get daycare in order to physically come into the office and to meet with a counselor. Equity training is deemed critical and ongoing with opportunities for self-awareness and bias and assumption work, right? We have to provide grace and provide room for our colleagues to be able, and for us to be able to do that work. Efforts are intentional to have counselors and staff that reflect the student population. So another quote from a student, I couldn't make any of the workshops, so I was so relieved that I could watch the recording with my baby in my lap and go online to ask questions. And this is a quote from a student who shared with me after we moved our probation workshops to being online. So when we move forward and look at outcomes, what do we see when we have an equity frame in our institutional outcomes? Black students succeed due to intentional and targeted efforts to acknowledge, address, and disrupt the water. We challenge it. We don't just accept it and say, this is the culture that we live in. We challenge that culture, right? In our counseling offices, what this looks like, Black students engage with counselors and counseling services early. Educational planning addresses the impact of systemic racism, and recommendations are made to disrupt the system. Counseling efforts are grounded in equity and actively work to disrupt anti-Black racism in serving Black students. And so this is another quote from a student who was meeting with one of our counselors in EOPS. And the student was, the counselor had asked the student, because they had mentioned something about how cool it was to be a doctor, and asked the student, have you ever thought about it? And the student's response was, I'd never met or even seen a Black doctor before. So how could I imagine myself being one? And the student relayed to me that the counselor came back with a name and a number for me to call. So the student was just floored that the counselor's response was, let me get you connected with a Black doctor so you can talk to that person and actually connect with somebody and see what representation looks like. That was a door that opened for that student that prior to that, the student had seen as not even an option. So we're going to take time to, again, respond to a prompt. So this time I want you to think, where do you see evidence of an equity frame in your counseling department? So we're going to be affirmative and think about the departments that you work in. And this time I want you to shift and see, where are the spaces and places where equity framing is happening, where we're able to identify the water, we're able to be intentional in reaching Black students. So again, you're going to access the link in the chat and respond to the prompt, and go ahead and put some ideas, some thoughts, some answers. So EOPS, right? Updating of hours to be open 4 days a week until 7 p.m. We have a more diverse counseling department to reflect our student population. And that's, representation matters, it's important, right? Other responses, equity training is deemed critical and ongoing. Saturdays and evenings are available until 8. Virtual services are approved to be an hour long to accommodate because it takes a little bit longer to help students to get online, for you to get online. Transfer workshops are offered on Saturdays, right? I'm seeing Saturdays. More diverse counseling department, right? EOPS, which in and of itself is one of our earliest and most successful equity programs, right? And serves as a best practice. Providing multiple days and hours for advising. Staffing and space are unapologetically allocated for Black students. I'm going to read that one again. Staffing and space are unapologetically allocated for Black students. That goes back to that word that it has to be intentional, right? Adding an equity topic to regular division meetings, being open different hours and times. Zoom is helping to make it easy for students. Diverse counselors are in the program. Hiring Black excellence counselors. The creation of Counseling Equity Committee. I love that. Academic and career pathway teams that are targeting Black and Latinx students and adult students. And I know that as somebody from our campus, those are efforts that are happening right now. Counselors and staff of color greet and meet students. And I think it's important for us to shift that distinction that representation is important, but we don't hire Black counselors to then say, congratulations and welcome to the space, go for it. Right? We hire Black counselors so that students can see that there's representation. And then we learn also from those counselors, how do we, and I'm going to use borrow a word from Emoja, how do we emojify our spaces so that any office a student walks into, a Black student walks into, they feel comfortable, right? Students can make appointments online or with their counselor, removing some of the barriers. We celebrate student strengths, focusing on these to promote students in our honors program. Staffing and space are, again, allocated. Extended hours are available. Diverse counselors. So as we go back to the presentation, I also want to share some additional examples of equity framing. So we can see that these are present in our offices, right? There's evidence that we can disrupt the water, that we can make a change even when there are unconscious factors and elements that are impacting us. The evidence is there. So some examples of this, and I'm gonna give props to Dr. Adrian Askernes, who welcomed us into this space as the former counseling department chair at MiraCosta. He was one of the first people to say, we need to get out of the office. And why are we so constrained with our offices, having a desktop computer in front of me and needing a desk? And so we were able to utilize funds to get tablets for our counselors and do mobile counseling where students went to where our students are located. And so one of the innovations that worked really well, especially for our students of color, where counselors would stand in the financial aid line, right? So there are students who are waiting to talk to a financial aid counselor, waiting to talk to somebody in financial aid to find out, am I able to get resources and support to come to college? Counselors would actually do drop-in counseling in the line, not wait for the student to be told by a financial aid technician, you also need to see a counselor, right? They would wait with the students. Counseling hours in the club room. So we have a Black Student Union space in our club room, and we have drop-in counseling that takes place right there in the club room. So the students don't need to walk to the counseling office. We're also showing intentionality in that, right? We had a block party in fall 2019 at my campus because we thought about as a Black community, what would a welcome look like, right? And that's not a formal event. We got a DJ. My husband was the DJ, so he was free. We had a DJ that came out. We had food, we had tables, and counselors were there tabling, mingling, talking with students, right? Again, that's an example of counselors coming to where students are. There's data on Black student success that is shared with students. We sometimes look at data and we don't share it with our students. And I had a student years ago who said to me, if you know that I am less likely to succeed because of specific factors, why wouldn't you come and tell me that so that I can make sure to avoid those roadblocks? And I can also hear from the institution what you are doing to help me to avoid those roadblocks, right? Or actually to remove those roadblocks so that they don't exist. So we share data openly and engage our students in conversations. Departments design activities and programs to intersect and support the Emoja program. right? We don't relegate all Black students to the Emoja program, but we magnify the voice of the Emoja program. If we were to emojify all counseling offices, what would that look like? We have best practices that are happening with our Emoja program. What can we learn from those best practices? Counseling retreats are focused on equity. Equity data and topics are shared at all counselor meetings or agendized at department meetings. So these are just a few examples of ways that we can look to identify the water and disrupt some of the unconscious elements that exist in our counseling offices and our environments at our campuses that can do harm to our Black students. This is a way that we can shift to an equity frame. So I'm going to hand it back over to Nicole, who's going to take us in a journey to talk about recommendations and where we can go from here.
Thank you. So we need to really look at the way forward. And there's been, again, a report from the California Community College Black and African American Advisory Panel that has, through town halls with about 800 community members and also about 36 participants in focus groups, arrived at these recommendations. This advisory panel was put together as a part of the Vision for Success with our California Community College Chancellor's Office in 2017. And here we have several recommendations for how we can move the needle in a positive direction and support our Black and African American students. So the number one issue that we really want to get our hands on and grapple with is financial aid. Financial aid continues to be a major stumbling block for our students, primarily lack of awareness of financial aid is the problem. Families and students are confused about the process of applying. They're not familiar with what the financial aid opportunities are that they can have. We have to do a better job of educating our community, our students, our parents, about the types of financial aid that are available to them, and help them understand that financial aid can be a gateway for them to be able to achieve their academic goals. We also have to look at isolation. Students who are of Black and African descent thrive in community. They thrive in an environment where they're able to be supported, they're able to have mentors, they're able to have role models on campus, off campus. That's why some of the programs that we have for our Black and African American students are so successful, because they're excellent at building community. Having our students on a campus where they're isolated, where they don't have support, where they can't find ways through the system to seek advice, to seek counsel, to really be able to see themselves as a scholar and as an individual who can be successful is a negative impact on their success. So we want to eliminate isolation. We want them to have a sense of belonging. We want every single student of African descent to be able to see themselves being successful, to be able to see themselves as a person who is supported on the campus. So we want to make sure that we eliminate isolation and work to provide a more inclusive environment and supports for our students. Also, lack of awareness of our career education pathways and career education programs. We have fabulous academic and career pathways on our community college campuses. We also have fabulous career education pathways, which provide pathways to high-paying jobs for a lot of our students. And a lot of our students don't have the knowledge of these programs, that they are available. So we have to do a better job of informing our students and our community about what these programs are and how they can support them, and help them pursue these new career pathways. Some of them are extremely innovative. At one of the colleges in my district, we have a drone program. So there's a lot of innovation in our career and education pathways, but our Black students aren't always aware of what those are. those positions, those pathways often are leading to very high paying jobs as well. Next, we want to do more of what we know works. We want to do more of our campus programs like Umoja and Amend and EOPS, programs that really support our Black students. We have seen the success rates in our Umoja programs. We know what happens when students are in the Umoja community and a part of the Umoja community. We understand that having mentorship from programs like Amend, we understand about the intentional counseling that comes through the EOPS program. And we have seen those success stories for our students who have had that additional support and interaction. So let's do more of that. Let's find ways to scale these programs. Let's find ways to get away from the boutique ideas that we have that they're only for a small number of students. And let's find a way to make those more robust and to do more of those programs that we know will provide the success for our students. In spite of any of the challenges, we see that there's a lot of optimism. Our students are very optimistic. There's many barriers, but they still are very optimistic about their future and their potential to be successful. We want to make sure that we keep that optimism and keep it high, and doing some of these interventions with regard to our focus and being intentional with our African American students can really help with that as well and keep that going. And lastly, outreach. We have to conduct outreach early and often. And outreach can take many different forms, but it has to be strategic and intentional, specifically for the Black community. We have to think about how can we create a campus environment where our Black students see themselves. What are the factors that we're employing in our campus community that help Black students identify with the sense of belonging on your campus? Does your campus have artifacts? Does your campus have any type of significant art or depiction of themselves in your campus environment? Do you welcome the Black community to your campus? Your local Black Chamber of Commerce or other Black organizations to your campus to see your facilities? Do you connect with the Black community and the campuses outside and externally outside of your campus? And Wendy had talked a little bit about how we have to go beyond our doors. We have to go beyond what is actually happening on our campus. We have to get into our community and let our Black students know that we're here to support you. And that involves building a sense of trust. Going into our community and making that connection, we want to make sure that if we're going to do it in an intentional manner, that we're doing it in a way in which we are going to make it clear that we're going to be there for the Black students when they come to our campus. When we're going out there and making promises, we want to make sure that we maintain that trust, that we're going to deliver on the promises that we give to them about how they can be successful on our campuses. We also can go out to reach these students even earlier beyond high school, like before they enter high school. We can start looking at outreach in the middle schools and reaching our students through that path as well. So definitely outreach early and often, connect with the Black community, make sure that you provide a welcoming environment on your campus, and make sure that you look at inviting the Black community to come to your campus and participate in events and utilize some of the beautiful facilities that we have. And next, we're going to talk about a call to action. So now that we've had about an hour or so of talking about lots of strategies and things that we can do, let's think a little bit more granularly about actions that we can take, okay? So actively work to dismantle students that make it difficult for students to succeed. We are all administrators or thought leaders or scholars or counselors. We are the professionals in the academic setting with a seat at the table. Our students may not have that seat. Let's be strategic about thinking about how we can dismantle any of the systems that have made it hard for them to succeed. With COVID-19, I have noticed the policy handbook has, in some instances, been kind of thrown out the window. We have been making many exceptions, pass, no pass, executive orders, withdrawal policies. There's been a lot of things that we have said, we can eliminate this. We can kind of massage this a little bit. We can take this and get it out of the way so that our students can be more successful. Let's put that critical eye beyond this pandemic on those policies, on those systems, and let's eliminate the barriers that are in the way for our students. Also, let's put a racial lens that acknowledges systemic racism that is present at your campus. Really take an inventory of what institutional structures you have that promote systemic racism and create barriers for your campus. And put a lot of thought into how you can eliminate them. And it can be in various forms. It can be you need more African-American faculty or Black faculty on your campus, or maybe you need more Black classified as sometimes the first people that folks are going to interact with on your campus, or more leaders who are Black or African-American. Or maybe you need to take a look at your strategic plan and see how you can infuse an equity lens into your strat plan. But whenever you're looking at dismantling oppressive structures, you have to think about how you can engage the Black and African American workers, leaders, faculty, staff on your campus in the conversation. Please do not create a draft and then ask for their input. When you are starting to build something that is going to be a new institution that is going to welcome our students of color, our Black students, make sure that you have Black members of your community at the table. We can look at history and we can see that historically, much of what has been built, much of what has been created didn't historically have the voices of those oppressed in the conversation. So make sure that we don't repeat history when we're looking at breaking down these oppressive structures. We want to build bridges for our students, and we want to provide access in ways beyond what the institution was initially built for. If our institutions, as Wendy referenced, were built way back in the early 1900s, and at times when segregation was present, or at times when we weren't able to really even gain access or admission to some of these institutions based on the color of our skin, then we may want to take a look at how we can move beyond that and build our institutions for them. So moving on into the next segment, I'm going to talk a little bit more about how to be intentional in our leadership and the role of administration in dismantling racism. So here is where it gets a little sticky, right? We have as administrators, we have so much on our plate. We have to balance so much. We have, especially if you're middle managers and you're working in the role of a dean or a director or a supervisor, and you have to balance the directives that are coming from your executive leadership. You also have to balance the needs of your faculty or your direct reports. But you really want to think about what your intentions are behind the work that you're doing. Are you centering Black and African American students in the work that you're doing? You have to also think about balancing compliance with meeting students where they are. We do have a lot of compliance and regulations, but we also have to understand that our humans really don't care about our paperwork. They don't care about our policies. They don't understand what that means. They just want to be served. So how do you find a way to balance that? How do you find a way to meet their needs, but also at the same time, make sure that you're balancing your regulations and compliances and adhering to that? Also, you need to understand, we have to think about what are our collective bargaining agreements saying? Dig into your collective bargaining agreements, understand your contracts, understand 10+1, understand faculty purview. but also understand what your role and responsibility is as an administrator and what right of assignment actually means. We all have a position to play. And the faculty have a role, they have their curriculum, they have the 10+1, but administrators, we have to be leaders and we have to really be able to see the black and white, but also find the gray and to build our faculty up to be able to understand the movement that we're taking towards this equity work and to gain their buy-in. We also are constantly advocating for resources for counseling. Counseling is a complex discipline that oftentimes is misunderstood. And resources in any institution are definitely scarce at any time. And so we have to constantly advocate for resources for counseling. In most instances, counseling doesn't necessarily always have enough counselors to be able to provide the dedicated attention that our students need. We also need to be able to support our faculty and our staff. Actively ask what they need. How can I help you? Find out what people on your team want. Find out what is going to help motivate them to be able to carry out the work that is needed and to be able to serve our students in a capacity that provides open access, inclusivity, and equity. We also want to make sure that we show empathy. It's easy to get desensitized. Many of us have seen a lot of the data and the lagging indicators and the equity gaps and all of this for our Black and African American students. And sometimes it can be like something we start to normalize. But let's normalize Black excellence and academic achievement and normalize success of our Black and African American students. And so we need to really be empathetic. We have to address we have to desensitize. And we have to make sure that we center equity in everything that we do. And there are ways that we can do it. We can do it in our agendas, we can do it in our priorities, we can do it in our retreats. We can make sure that we have equity conversations with our colleagues on a regular basis. These conversations aren't necessarily easy. Sometimes they're extremely difficult. Sometimes you may have individuals who don't agree with what it is that you are, they don't agree with what you're saying. They have a totally different understanding or belief system. And that's where it becomes very difficult to have the conversation. But as leaders, I believe it is our job to really center equity in everything, to set the example, to be the leader that is going to show the rest of our team and our institution how to do this work. We also want to make sure that we stay on top of the data, and we should also be extremely outraged by the gaps that we find. We definitely need to not accept it as the norm. We should be angry. We should be upset. It should promote us to want to do something to move the needle. And we should have like some kind of, desire to do it quickly. And additionally, we need to look at professional development. And one of the things that I do, I had seen something in the chat about folks will show up to professional development and they'll leave early and they won't necessarily participate. I have control of the schedule. So what I do is I put it on your schedule. So it's scheduled time within a meeting or within our agenda or within your workday, where we're going to actually all participate in this professional development activity. When we were on campus, we might all go to a big conference room, or we might all go to a big classroom and participate, but it's scheduled time because this is important work. And it's important that it isn't something that becomes like, oh, in your spare time, you have to do this. No, this is the work that we need to do as a part of our day-to-day lives. And so moving on to intentional leadership and the role of institutions in dismantling racism. And you see this quote here that we've heard a million times: every system is perfectly designed to get the results that it gets. And so what is your system designed for? What is your institution designed for? Is your institution designed for Black and African American students to achieve greater academic success? Is your institution designed to close these equity gaps? We have to take institutional responsibility for equity work. And we have to center the experiences of our Black and African American students in this work at all times. We also have to demonstrate an institutional commitment to equity. And we also know that we want to make sure that we're showing the folks that are actually doing the equity work on our campuses that we have their back as an institution, that we are going to be there for them when the going gets rough. We also want to look at allocating resources and resourcing our equity programs and efforts. And we want to make sure that we institutionalize positions. So when we have categorical funds, we bring in, sometimes we'll bring in a faculty member on categorical monies or on soft monies, or we'll get a grant and we'll have an opportunity to hire someone. And then once the grant funding goes away, sometimes the positions or the programs go away. We'll sometimes have one member on our campus or in our college departments that is the equity champion, and they're doing everything. They're running programs and they're doing activities and co-curricular things for students. And then they retire or something happens and now everything is kind of falling apart. We need to institutionalize these efforts so that they live beyond the life of a grant. They live beyond the person who may be actually doing the work. It shouldn't fall on one individual. These are institutional commitments that need to be made. And we have to demonstrate an urgency for change. And we have to accept nothing but that. We have a moral obligation to do something for our students. Our students are here seeking our help. They're coming to us for the promise of a college education. And we want to make sure that we fulfill that promise, which should be in every single one of our institutional missions. So moving on to our next slide, we are now in the phase of Q&A.
Yes, so we want to thank you, Nicole and Dr. Stewart. Man, that was amazing dynamic. I feel like I have 1,000,001 questions, and so do some of our panelists. So I'm going to start with the first question. This will be directed to Dr. Stewart, since you the slide focused on structural, systemic, institutional racism. Would the model minority myth be considered a part of the structural, systemic, institutional racism?
Oh, that's a good question. I think yes, right? When we're talking about systemic racism, our focus is in talking about Black students, but we know students of color and students from marginalized communities are impacted as well. And so just as our Black students walk on our campus and people make assumptions, right, about what students are capable of doing without taking into account the history and the impact of systemic racism, the barriers that student had to overcome just to walk on our campuses. The model minority myth, which is this assumption and making stereotypes about our Asian American students. And I think the thing that's important with that is we have to get to a point where we are able to disaggregate the data also for our Asian American students. And so without going on and on, at MiraCosta, we disaggregated, for example, our Native Hawaiian Pacific Islander students. We are located in Oceanside, where there is a very large Samoan community. And when we disaggregated the data, we found equity gaps for our Native Hawaiian Pacific Islander students. So we have to get to a point also where we're not only dismantling stereotypes like the model minority myth, but we also are disaggregating data, taking into account that we have multiple ethnicities that are represented in that in API data, right? That's an aggregate. We have to disaggregate that and break it down and start to understand the different communities. It's also about acknowledging narrative too, and not making the assumption or sending the message that there's just one narrative for multiple populations of students.
I have question number two. How do you bring up topics like systemic racism when you have people in your department who are part of the problem?
That's a really good question. And I think as long as we're talking about equity, we have to talk about race and we have to talk about systemic racism. And I think you just have to be true to your values, to your beliefs. If you really believe in this work and you really believe in what we need to do for our students, then you have to be able to engage in the conversations. We have been having these conversations at my institution for quite a while, and there have been a number of people who have wanted to derail the conversations over the course of years. And so I understand what the challenges are, but you have to find those that are like-minded and take the critical mass of individuals who want to get this work done and find a way to be able to persevere and go through with the conversation in spite of the detractors who really don't see things the same way that you do.
So with that being said, another question then was, how can we trust the institutions when there were educators and people in government and power that were part of and attended the July 6th insurrection at the Capitol?
Oof, that's a deep one.
Yes, it is.
I mean, here's the thing. It's like a keep it real moment, right? It's when we talk about the water and we've got these strategies, but it's big, right? And we know that there are folks who are in our institutions now who are part of the problem. And so I think that's part of the issue too. And I know that people might be in vulnerable positions where you may or may not be able to speak out. You might not necessarily feel comfortable. You might not necessarily feel like you're going to have job security if you do that. So it's got to be addressed, right? I think about my son. I don't want him to like change needs to happen. And just one recommendation I would give is at Maricosta, we had a hate crime that happened on our campus, and our Black community came together. But folks, people are naturally nervous about sharing too openly what their experience is. They're afraid of being typecast. They're afraid of retaliation. So you have your community also. So we had a forum that was on campus, and I was strategic in making phone calls to the president of the NAACP, to members of our Black Greek lettered organizations, to we have a North County African American Women's Association, to folks who are movers and shakers in the community to say, show up for us, right? To help send the message. And I work at a campus that is committed. And so, but I know that folks are at campuses where, again, it might not necessarily be comfortable for you to be in that role to speak out. So I would say you have to be unapologetic. You have to move forward with it. You have to take risks, but you have other resources other than just the folks on the campus to make that push and to address it. Now, if you have folks that were at the Capitol, I mean, that's deep, right? How do you address that? And you have to ask yourself, what's happening in my environment that is or isn't serving as a barrier to Black students, and what needs to happen to change to make a way for Black students? So that's also something where, engage your community in that conversation.
Another YouTube question. I keep hearing that guided pathways is equity, but I'm noticing very broad approaches. How can equity and anti-racism serve as central to guided pathways?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I think if you understand what we're supposed to be doing with equity in Title V and our Student Equity and Achievement Program, and if we think about resources, right? So when we had to when we had the Student Success Act of 2012, we'll go back to then, right? And we got SSSP funding, and then with equity funding, we had to have an equity plan on file. And all that has moved now into the Student Equity and Achievement Program, as well as guided pathways. Well, the intention of the legislature was for us to focus on our funding on those disproportionately impacted communities on each campus. That is why we have the funding. That is what we're supposed to be doing with the funding. And that is a whole primary issue in terms of how we're utilizing funding on many of our campuses. A lot of folks don't really understand that connection between the resources and the movement to really eliminate equity gaps. So the equity gaps are there. They're in your data. If you've disaggregated your data and you've written a student equity plan, or you've submitted an SEA report, then your campus should have a plan that shows you what those indicators are in terms of who your DI populations are on your campus. Lots and many of our campuses have Black and African American students as a part of our DI populations. When we look at equity and we look at the language in Title V of what equity says we're supposed to do, well, that's tied into guided pathways with the Student Equity and Achievement Program. So it's all intertwined. So we have to center equity in guided pathways in order to be able to close the achievement gaps that we're seeing. And that's part of the reason why we're doing guided pathways, is to close achievement gaps, because we've seen that the way we've been doing it without having guided pathways, that we have the data that we have right now, where students are spending 6 years getting, an associate's degree, or 6 years before they transfer, or dropping out because they haven't, been able to persist, and we can't retain them for various reasons and various factors. That's one of the reasons behind the movement for acceleration. That's one of the reasons behind the movement for the Student Success and Support Program, which was get students a comprehensive education plan so that they understand what it is that they need to complete to reach their goal. Yeah, I've spent a lot of time in school myself, and I don't know that I would go to any institution where it was a mystery what I needed to do, what I needed to take before I could actually graduate. And so guided pathways is there to demystify, which is a huge factor, and help educate our students on what they need. It's also there to help eliminate barriers to access, as access is an equity issue. And we know that a lot of our students are being excluded on the access, just at the access points to our courses.
Thank you. Man, there are a lot of questions coming in, so we have probably time for one more question, but also wanted to let you know, one person indicated that they thoroughly enjoyed the webinar series, and they basically wanted to know, after this pandemic, are we going to do this in person again? So just a FYI, something to think about. So a question here: how can we measure our effectiveness short-term and honestly? So as it relates to professional development, as an example, kind of going beyond attendance.
Yeah, well, I think first of all, we always have to go back to the data, right? And communities of color traditionally have been victimized by data. Data has been used to further systemic racism, but we have to engage in data. The data tells the story, right? And I'm not just talking about numbers, I'm talking about qualitative data too. So I think number one, whether it's short-term or long-term, we constantly have to be in touch with the experience of our students. We have to provide opportunities for students to tell us what it is that is happening and how we as an institution can help. And that right there, not all of us do that. We get into rooms and we design strategies to assist students. Rarely do we engage students in that process and then center students, right? If we asked our Black students, what would you do to fix the institution, to create spaces that are more welcoming? What do you think needs to happen in order for you to walk through the doors of a counseling office and feel like, yeah, somebody here is invested in my success, right? And going to help me to succeed. And when you get those honest answers, move, right? Don't just ask questions for the sake of asking. Share that data, which is including the student narrative, and move, make action, make changes, and then continually follow up with students. So it can't just be a one-time conversation. I think also when you do that, students also feel the love. They feel that, yeah, I'm important because my voice is elevated, and there's questions that people ask what my experience is. And then I can see that what I'm saying is actually enacting change. I think the second part of that question, Adrian, was related specifically to COVID. Was there a COVID component to it?
Basically, they wanted to know, it was basically another question. Somebody wanted to know, will we be able to confer in person again to kind of address these series that we had as it relates to equity and counseling, specifically for our African-American students?
I mean, so know that this was, and I know we're running out of time, this was pulled together by practitioners. So we didn't get together to say, oh, we're experts in the field, we're going to create a 4-part webinar series to impart expertise. We are practitioners, right? Nicole and I are administrators. Luis works with the Career Ladders Project. The counselors that we're presenting are counselors that are doing the work in our offices. So our goal in this is just to continue the conversation, because we have to start somewhere, right? And there's a lot of resources that are out there, but we intend to continue this work. We've talked about creating a website and continuing to partner with the California Counseling Network to focus on providing resources specific to counseling, so that we can make systemic change, right? Because it really is about collective work. It's about community work. So I know that we're about to run out of time, so I'm going to hand it back over to Adrian and Luis to close us out. But thank you, really great questions.
So quickly, these are questions and people have been asking in the chat, will this be sent out? This is a recording, so Career Ladders Project will be sending out the recording. But these are just some questions that you can take back to your community and have a dialogue as it relates to, taking it to the porch. And I think this will be very critical for you to continue this dialogue and conversation at your institution. So again, we want to thank you very much for connecting with us. And we definitely look forward to connecting with you in the near future. So I want to pass it over to Luis.
Thank you, thank you, thank you. This has been a wonderful journey with all of you. And I know there's been a lot of activity on the chat. We hope to continue the conversation. So please do join us on joining the community of networks of counselors, practitioners, sharing with practitioners. The link will be in the chat for you to join. I also want to mention that later this afternoon, actually noontime, we are going to be having a CACN roundtable focused on welcoming new students into college. So if you want to hear from another set of practitioners, that'll be another opportunity. We want to thank, again, on behalf of the Career Ladders Project team that has supported these wonderful practitioners and scholars. Special thanks to Dr. Wendy Stewart and all of you. You were just magnificent. And as someone said on the chat that I saw, they really loved the practicality because it was from a practitioner's perspective, but added in there so much rich, deep research, evidence, and concepts and ideas that we need in our practice. Thank you, all of you, for joining us. Really appreciate it. We'll be seeing you online. Thank you. Be safe.